of a workshop that we've been having here at Universidad de Chile. The workshop was about indigenous political economy. This is actually the sixth version of a workshop that we organize annually at the Institute, Millennium Institute of Marketing Perfection and Public Policies. The workshop is on political economy and political science. And actually the idea of this workshop is to bring together economists working in political economy mainly, and also political scientists so we can think together in different topics. No? Before we have topics about conflict, about some public policies, but for this year the focus was in indigenous political economy. We have a very fruitful discussion in the last 2 days with international speakers, local speakers. We've been discussing issues about the indigenous people in North America, but also a lot about the indigenous people in Chile. And for this final event, we're going to have a kind of a policy discussion panel where we have a very international panel. So let me introduce the speakers. Well, first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Dani Jaimovich, professor of economics at the Universidad de Talca, also member of the institute, one of the organizers. And we have Randall Aki that is joining us from the US. Actually, I'm not sure where are you in the US, but you are in the cloud somehow. But yeah, thanks for joining. Of course, the idea was to invite him in person, but it was not. He couldn't make it this year, but thanks for joining us at least online. So Randall is associate professor at the University of California in Los Angeles in public policy. And he's also the president of the Association for Economic Research of Indigenous People. And I think we invited members of this association to join this panel. Many of them are joining through the Zoom. So I also give you the welcome to this panel. And you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of the session. This is also on live in YouTube, so I guess also some people are watching us in YouTube. You can also ask some questions through the chat over there. So let me now introduce to the speakers that are with us in person. First of all, Don Fair, thanks for coming, for sharing us with us in this workshop. Don is a professor in the University of Victoria, working in topics related to indigenous economics. So we had yesterday her presentation about the slaughter of the bison, and we've been discussing about different topics. So thanks for coming to Chile and to coming to the workshop. And we have also Kaylee Bauer. She's a professor at Nebraska Wesleyan University in political science. She actually presents us a book that summarizes a lot of fieldwork, many years of fieldwork that she did in Chile to try to understand land policy of the government through the indigenous people in Chile. So thanks also for coming. For you, you've been in Chile many times, but to be part of this workshop. So for today, for this panel, we have called it Indigenous Self-Determination and Constitutional Rights. And just to give you an idea, especially to the international audience, of why we are discussing this, is because currently in Chile we are in the process of the discussion of a constitutional change. Actually, 3 weeks ago we have a referendum of a proposal for a new constitution that was drafted during a year by a convention that was democratically elected with a lot of debate. And part of this debate, and actually one of the main debate, was about indigenous rights and how to incorporate different aspects of indigenous self-determination in the constitution, which is in the current constitution is basically zero. No, there is not recognition, not mention of the indigenous people, and the discussion was how to put there. There were many dimensions on how to incorporate indigenous rights, but actually this proposal was rejected by a large margin in this voting. So this proposal will not be a new constitution, and now we are in the process of how to draft a new constitution where, of course, indigenous rights will be very relevant. So the idea here is to know a little bit more about the international perspective, how it works in the US, Canada, also in other countries, either through the constitution or the law or the jurisdiction, so we can have some comparative perspective on how to implement it in Chile, and of course also to learn how it's over there. So to begin this panel, each of the presenters will have around 7 minutes to introduce the topic. We're going to start with Randy, with Randall Aki. You have 7 minutes. I'll let you know where you are more or less in minute 5. So please, Randy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm Randy Aki. I'm calling to you from Washington, D.C., the ancestral homeland of the Anacostia people here. And again, I'm very sorry that I couldn't be there in person, but look forward, hopefully, at some point in the future to be there. So, you know, I think talk a little bit about sort of the U.S. and the situation. You know, when people think of sort of indigenous peoples, Native Americans in the U.S., they think of American Indians who occupy the 48 U.S. states and Alaskan Natives who reside in Alaska, the indigenous peoples of Alaska. And then there's also Native Hawaiians from the Pacific Islands. And that's actually where I'm from, my home. I'm Polynesian. But there are other additional indigenous peoples within the United States as well. In the larger portion of the U.S., there are indigenous peoples in Puerto Rico, which is a territory of the United States, the Taino people. And there are other territories such as Guam, off in the far western Pacific, the Chamorro people, as well as American Samoa. So there are other Polynesians as well, Pacific Islanders who are Samoan. So there's a wide range of indigenous peoples with different backgrounds, different histories. And actually Chile has indigenous peoples up and down, but also Pacific Islanders with Isla de Pascua, the Rapa Nui, the indigenous peoples of Easter Island as well. So again, there's some similarities there. But just, you know, the overall situation with regard to indigenous peoples at the time of the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, the only indigenous peoples encountered or thought of were American Indians, of course, at that point. And American Indians were not considered citizens and were not part of the new country. There was treaty making that occurred between the government and the tribes, and that was to take over from the treaty making that had happened, you know, with the various colonies in the U.S., the states, and so the U.S. federal government took power over that, and that remained the way things were done. The relationship was treaty to treaty or nation to nation, and that changed as the U.S. You know, over time expanded. There was ultimately American Indians, all indigenous peoples, as the U.S. expanded westward in the early 1900s, created a path towards citizenship for American Indians, essentially granted everyone citizenship that didn't have citizenship prior to that. And then there was a return to a relationship, federal to federal relationship between the tribal governments including Alaska Native villages in the 1970s, and the US federal government. And there had been a long period of time in which tribal officials hadn't been able to govern effectively resources, land, peoples, and there's a return to that. It's, there's still work to be done, but largely in the last 50 years, there's been much more of a return to self-governance by tribal nations on their lands, with their people and with their resources. And I think ultimately, the experience has been the more self-governance, the more autonomy tribal communities have had, tribal nations have had, their economic conditions, I think we could say on average, have improved. So, I think it's a good thing, and I think it's a long time coming, but nevertheless, I think that is some of the primary foundational aspects that I think I'd like to talk about. And I'll stop there for now.
Great. Thank you, Randy, for the introduction. So Don, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the situation in Canada?
Yeah, certainly. So first, to start, so I'm Don. I'm currently an associate professor in the Klingon Territory. I was born and raised in Treaty 7 territory in Canada. So like in the US, under the Royal Proclamation of 1763, formed a nation-to-nation relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples and nations in Canada. And today, Indigenous nations are still nations and have the right to self-governance under Canada's Constitution, and also all of this British law that actually set the foundation for the Canadian state and Canadian law today. The Constitution of 1982 in Canada actually enshrines Indigenous rights. So specifically, Section 35(1) of Canada's Constitution states the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. Now, the term Aboriginal people in Canadian law refers to First Nations people, sometimes called quote-unquote Indians in Canadian law, also the Métis, who are a unique nation that evolved as a consequence of contact and intermarriage with Europeans who formed unique communities and have a unique political status in Canada, and also the Inuit. Now, for the purposes of Canadian law, due to recent decisions by the Supreme Court, actually all people count as quote-unquote Indian for Canada's purposes, which are related into something of federal responsibility. So particularly for a long time, Indigenous nations were governed, and people in their lives were governed by something called the Indian Act. The Indian Act still exists, and it still does govern the lives of many people and nations. And this piece of legislation is actually probably the most amended piece of legislation in Canadian history, and it's really evolved a lot over time. So nowadays, many of the things that were done by the Indian Act would be illegal under Canada's Bill of Rights that protects the freedom of religion, etc. Now, in terms of actual practical governing powers that Indigenous nations have in Canada, pragmatically what they can actually do, varies pretty dramatically by the nation. So in some areas, what are called band governance or First Nations governance, and again, there's a lot to unpack with what I mean by that. But pragmatically, some have very few and limited powers. Some have powers that are much more similar to that of municipalities, and you can opt in to these sorts of governance strategies outside of the Indian Act. But beyond that, some First Nations communities are not under the Indian Act at all anymore, and in fact actually have modern self-governance agreements that started to be signed in the 1970s. There's about 26 of these self-governance agreements in Canada now, and there's also sectoral governance agreements where they can manage things like education. Now, if you have self-governance agreements, your powers, again, it varies depending on the agreement, but are something more akin to that of a province or a state in the United States. So some of them implement income tax, whether or not you're actually a First Nations member. Also, recent Supreme Court decisions have increased Indigenous autonomy and power in many areas through something called the duty to consult. And this has led to a lot more impact benefit agreements, which are agreements essentially with natural resource extraction firms or other firms to benefit from potentially infringed upon Aboriginal rights and title. Now, there's other ways that Indigenous nations can govern increased jurisdictions. So the jurisdiction of band governments tends to be only on reservation, but reservation lands have actually been growing over time through something called the treaty land entitlement process or the civics claims process. And actually, nowadays, there's 120 urban reserves in Canada that have been created as part of this process, where First Nations have gained jurisdiction, actually in urban areas that were deprived of them previously because of the Great Plain territories they reserved through treaty. Now, I feel there's so many things we could potentially talk about, a lot of things that seem similar to Chile, some things that are not, things that are similar in between the US and other places, but I will also stop so to leave more time for questions.
Perfect, yeah, that's the idea, just an introduction, and then we go with detail in some of the different aspects. So Kelly, you have studied quite a lot the situation in Chile, so maybe if you can introduce about how do you understand the comparison of the situation in Chile with US that you're probably more familiar with Canada.
Yeah, thank you. So Kelly Bauer at Nebraska Wesleyan University, and been kind of focusing on Chilean Indigenous politics since maybe 2008 or so. And yes, certainly Indigenous politics in Chile are quite different. So most obviously, lack of constitutional recognition, and I'm sure we'll get into what current conversations have been. I thought maybe a little history would be useful, and certainly for Chileans in the audience, this is not new, but for a more international audience, hopefully that helps contextualize some of these differences. So estimates are that about 12% of Chile identifies as Indigenous, and the vast majority of that identifies as Mapuche. Certainly there are other Indigenous communities, but I think similar to the US context, a lot of Indigenous policy has developed out of demands of the Mapuche community. So not to dismiss demands and other policies that are in place, but kind of a lot of state policy is about relationships between the state and the Mapuche community. So historically, I think it's important to point out that the Mapuche were not incorporated into either the Incan or Spanish empires, and there was a really brutal pacification campaign, I quote this, in the late 1800s that resulted in Mapuche territory becoming part of the Chilean state and a process of dividing Mapuche territory into about 3,000 plots of land. And those plots of land, as we've discussed a lot the last 2 days, have been the result of a lot of different policy practices over time and all sorts of processes of division, at times kind of coming back together as a plot. And many of these were dissolved, particularly during the Pinochet dictatorship. There was an important period of mobilization towards the end of the Pinochet dictatorship that resulted in an agreement between Mapuche organizations and the incoming President Elwin, who was first in the return to democracy. And because of that agreement, we get a negotiated 1993 Indigenous law. So the 1980 Constitution that is still in practice does not recognize Indigenous communities. So a lot of the policies that are being in place now come out of that 1993 law. I think it's important, the regional context here. Chile is a lot of times behind where a lot of other Latin American countries have gone in terms of recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights. So of course, we see a lot of mobilization at the 500 years since the arrival of Columbus to the Americas. And Chile did see some of that regional mobilization, but we have not seen the transition into some practices that led out of powerful movements, particularly in Ecuador and Bolivia. So in kind of the chunk of years since the return to democracy, I would characterize probably 3 different ways that policy has evolved and kind of conversations about Indigenous rights have evolved. So one, and based on my own research, I think is really important, conversations about land purchases. So the government has created a mechanism through which Indigenous community, if they can document in the right ways, can request the government to purchase land on behalf of that community. So we have seen a lot of funding and controversy around that program. We also see a lot of socioeconomic development projects. And so I think there's kind of a critique of the extent to which post-dictatorship governments have kind of pulled Indigenous demands into kind of a socioeconomic development framework through the ways that some of these programs and policies are structured. Third, I would say it's important to keep in mind the prioritization of extractive industries in some of these regions. That has very much, it's not explicitly a policy between state and Indigenous communities, but certainly structures the ways that a lot of these conversations have evolved. And then fourth, I think we need to pay attention to what is referred to as conflict in the region in southern Chile. So a lot of this, there is Mapuche activism and mobilization, but there's also tremendous state repression and criminalization. So I think there's a concerning application of the anti-terrorism law against Indigenous activists, militarization in the region, extensive police presence. And so there's been kind of a trend to securitize what are often Indigenous rights demands. And that has become very complicated and contentious in recent years, and we can certainly talk about that. I think that's where I'll stop my intro. I think 2019 protests are a clear kind of point of departure in some of these conversations, and I'm sure much of that will come up in conversation.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. That's really great to put it in perspective, what is going on in Chile. And this is a lot of what we have been discussing in our workshop. So in the constitutional proposal, it was called a plurinational proposal, which is a definition that is very Latin American, no? But I would say that there were probably four main aspects of this plurinationality that I would like to discuss more in detail. These four aspects were access to land, which has been already mentioned by all of you and particularly by Kelly. Also, the right to develop traditions, including language, traditional medicine, and related traditions. Political representation, in particular in the proposal, there was the idea of establishing reserve seats in the parliament and also in other government bodies. And also the judicial system, to have the traditional judicial system on each of the indigenous people. So let me start maybe with the first one that's already been touched upon, but just to get more in depth which is one of the aspects that is most recognized in international treaties, which is access to land, to the traditional territories. So in the proposal, following actually international treaties, was mentioned that the preferential way of restitution was access to this historically claimed land. As Kelly has mentioned, there is already a law that kind of deal with this, but it's been quite problematic in its implementation. So it will be interesting to go a bit more in depth of how this process of land restitution has going on in different countries. So let me start with you, Randy, about specifically how this works in the US and maybe what kind of lessons we can get from the history of this process in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it's for the US, it's really complicated with regard to land, depending on whether or not a tribal government and an indigenous people had an existing land base formed out of a treaty, or if they were post the treaty making era, sort of had a portion of land that was recognized as a traditional homeland. And so the granting and the awarding of land rights and jurisdictions differs across different indigenous peoples in the US. And there are, many indigenous peoples that do not have control or self-governance on their territories still to this day. So, so just acknowledging that sort of fact that there's a variety of different land tenure or situations of self-governance on territories, on lands that exist across the different indigenous peoples in the US. Among those that have, well-defined parcels and land bases that they inhabit and they govern, self-govern. There's been a movement in over time to increase the size of those land bases. Previously, historically, some of the land had been sold off to non-natives, non-Indians, for various reasons and various methods. And so some communities now have some resources to buy those parcels back and bring the community back and, make it whole again to some extent. In other places, and just recently, the US Supreme Court ruled that portions of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is home to the Muskogee Creek peoples, actually is part of a reservation which hadn't been designated as so or hadn't been addressed as so until the Supreme Court decision ruled that to be the case. So there's a wide variety of sort of ways in which land and jurisdiction and self-governance occurs in the US. And I think the best way to say it is it's just idiosyncratic. So there's no one really standard way. Congress, the US legislature can make a designation that creates a land base and designates a community. On the other hand, the executive, the presidential branch of the US under the Department of the Interior also has that ability as well. So there are two different processes through which that can occur. And they're parallel to each other and independent of each other. And so with that, I'll stop.
Let me just ask you one question to understand that, because you mentioned mainly federal authorities, no? You mentioned the president, the Supreme Court. Well, how it works at the state level? Do the states have some legislative power, and as you say, they differ a lot between different states?
Yeah, I mean, the US the federal government is much stronger than the state governments in the sense, lots of power and funding and of course, lots of ways. And so it's supreme to that, right? It sort of overcomes or many state activities. There are some states that recognize tribal governments that the federal government doesn't. So there's some, differences there. Ultimately, I think there are more potential benefits of federal being under the federal jurisdiction than the state. The states, not always, but can be less. It's very complicated. But states can provide some impact, some sorts of resources, but very little. The key thing with regard to land is that when land is held in trust by the US federal government, it's not subject to state taxation, the state of, the particular state, as well as the jurisdiction. So being recognized at the federal level means that there's, some exemption from state level taxes as well, income taxes as well. So there are some, tangible benefits that differ between those recognition levels.
Great, thank you very much. So Don, how is the situation in Canada?
Yeah, there's two, it's complicated, like in the US as well, of course. But there's two kind of like large processes that First Nations can go to reacquire their territories. And I'll talk a little bit about outside of those processes in a moment. One, I already mentioned one, the specific land claims process, which is sometimes tied into something called treaty land entitlements. And this is where in a treaty or some sort of other government agreement, a nation was promised that had certain land reserved that was not reserved and could be added back to the land base. Now, the claims process also deals with other compensation for historic wrongs that may not have to do with land, but sometimes the funds gained from those historic claims or historic wrongs can be used to purchase land. that land can be either continued to be held in fee simple property, which is not really out of, it doesn't have the same sort of Indigenous jurisdiction over it, so like not the same ability to make laws, or you could add it to the reserve. They say reserve in Canada rather than reservation for several reasons, I guess, but point being is it can be part of the jurisdiction or not, and that's the choice of the nation. The other process is a lot larger and generally outside of treated areas. Not all of Canada is actually under a historic treaty, and that's actually a problem for Canadian law because of the Royal Proclamation and the subsequent laws that reinforced it. In order for land to be under the jurisdiction of the Crown, it has to be brought in that way through a negotiated arrangement. So you can go through a comprehensive land claims process to reacquire your territory, right? Now that is a very long, a very expensive process. A civic claims process is also very long. I mean, there are cases that have been going on for much before, like any of us here were alive, right? So some of these things are very long and expensive. So that process is not necessarily one that every nation wants to undergo to reacquire jurisdiction. These comprehensive treaties also are often simultaneously negotiated with the self-government agreements that I had mentioned earlier, which allows communities to opt out of the Indian Act entirely. In terms of the other ways to assert jurisdiction over land, as I mentioned, our Constitution recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights. So Aboriginal rights are generally thought to have two components. First is just Aboriginal rights more generically, which are often tied to Indigenous rights to land, but also Aboriginal title, which is something that Canadian law recognizes. So you can have Aboriginal title in your traditional territories, and that's can be really powerful, right? If a land is denoted to be to have an Aboriginal title on it, that essentially the nation requires all the rights of fee simple over that land. Now, that doesn't mean that they can kick out private property owners. Like that is a bit of a complication. That doesn't give the power to do that. But the existence of an Aboriginal right or a treaty right in a particular region, or the potential existence of infringement on that right, requires the provinces to negotiate, right, and to make sure it's not a veto, right? There are mechanisms to get around it, but you can ensure that any impact of, say, natural resource development on those Aboriginal rights is mitigated, right? So there's a responsibility to account for the Indigenous interest in the land. Again, whether it's through a treaty right or through Aboriginal title or another form of Aboriginal right. Now, what exactly that fully entails is still being worked out by the Canadian courts. Yeah. And of course, there are still protests and I should say that a lot of these changes that have occurred since the 1970s and the real recognition of these rights, the enshrinement of Indigenous rights in the Constitution, are the consequence of Indigenous activists, leaders, and mobilization more generally.
When was it exactly recognized? Okay.
Yeah, so but before that, there was actually another legal case in the late 1970s that basically overturned a previous decision by the Supreme Court that there was still a potential existence for Aboriginal right and title outside of treaty areas. So a lot of actually the power of Indigenous nations in areas that are not their reservations has been driven by Supreme Court decisions, which are due to Indigenous people fighting in the courts for their rights under Canadian law.
Yeah. So actually, that reminds me of, I think 2 months ago, there was a case where Trudeau governments paid money to a community. This was a case that was quite discussed here when we still were debating the proposal, because it came this idea of like the preferential way of restitution is land, but it could be also compensation. So I don't know if you can explain it, how exactly is that they came up that in this particular case they gave a monetary compensation instead of land. I don't know if you know that.
So I'm not quite sure which decision you're referring to, but there are many cases where First Nations will be given money instead of land, in part because sometimes the land that's claimed is politically very difficult. And then you have to compensate, give fair compensation to landowners if they're going to be removed from what is they perceive to be their property for long periods of time or in short periods of time. A lot of compensation has occurred through settlements related to historic wrongs as well, like residential schools. So that's an alternative path that some communities have pursued. And then what they can do is they can use these monies, and I know nations in the US have done the same, and put them into their own kind of, you could call them, some are trust accounts, which are held on the behalf of the federal government. But you could also, another way to think about these is our like sovereign wealth funds that nations can draw on as well, to help assert their jurisdiction or to provide services to their members, or as per capita payments as well, if they want to take that option.
Yeah, thank you. So Kelly, you have studied land policy extensively, the land policy in Chile. You follow the discussion so far of the constitutional debate. So what do you think would be the best way to move forward instead of access to land and to traditional territories in the current discussion in Chile?
It's a harder question.
Sorry, it's a very hard question.
So I think some useful context is that it seems in contrast to these other two cases, in the Chilean context, there has been a mechanism for communities to request land. Like similar to the other cases, it is incredibly complicated in that the communities need very specific documentation and are kind of left out of some of these policies that might be a way to access land without those documents. I think that program has been tremendously complicated and kind of ugly in its implementation. And so, yes, of course, it's kind of, we think about what are alternatives and what might this look like. If and when there's a new constitution, a new kind of policy framework, I think the reality is we don't know much. I think what we've learned out of the 20-some years of implementation of this land purchase program is that we need to be careful of very state-defined logics of understanding territory. And we also need to think a lot about some of the mechanisms that are currently not in place in the Chilean context and certainly are problematic in the US and Canadian context, but are a step forward in terms of governance and autonomy and degrees of self-determination, kind of need to be part of the conversation going forward. So I think a lot of what the existing policy does is provide a mechanism for a purchase. It is a buyer willing purchase. So this is not an expropriation situation. If a current landowner does not want to sell the land, that community's claim kind of has no path forward. And the burden is also on the community to present that. So it's a very kind of transactional market-based model and does not come with kind of jurisdictional authority after that purchase. So there's, I think, kind of a shift about how do we think more about territorial demands that are less defined by kind of these state documents and state logics, and what would it look like for kind of a more meaningful recuperation of ancestral territory, not just access to land. You know, I think that transition from access to land to ancestral territorial recovery is an important distinction that needs to be made as conversations move forward.
Exactly, because as you mentioned, so far the claims over land need to be with a document that shows that this land was part of these reservations, no? That we call these títulos de merced. But how do you see? Because in the proposal of the new constitution, there was this concept of the territory, no? But in practice, how do you see that the claims can go beyond what it was título de merced and claim the traditional land? How do you think this could be implemented?
Yeah, I mean, I think the easy answer is I'm not sure. I think the more complicated answer is that there needs to be kind of a way of thinking about political power in association with, you know, land as a specific market commodity. And so I think there's kind of a focus oftentimes in the Chilean context on land as the end goal. And I think if we kind of broaden the conversation, say rather what does meaningfully controlling political power in a certain area, what does that look like? I think that opens up a range of kind of policy opportunities. So, you know, part of the proposal in the Constitution that wasn't necessarily tied to specific Indigenous rights, but certainly is relevant, is kind of devolution and decentralization of a lot of power. And I think that certainly is kind of, could be part of the conversation if we think about territory more broadly. How could Indigenous communities exercise more power and more control over certain areas? So it's not exactly an answer, but it's kind of a reframing of, thinking less about land and more about kind of this devolution of power and control for local communities.
Exactly. I mean, just to explain maybe a bit more to the international audience, one of what I call the original sin of the land distribution for indigenous people is that we created, not we, but in the 19th century, they were created these 3,000 small pieces of plots. By small, I talk about around 100 hectares each, but that were all separated to each other, not so there is no continuity. And in the new constitution, was this idea of having these indigenous autonomous territories, but it's difficult to define what it is. It is a group of this reservation or what it is. No, so I think this is one of the most complicated aspects. Thanks. Let me go to the other of the topics that was very much into discussion. That was about political representation of the indigenous group. So in the proposal was the idea of reserved seats for the parliament, but also for other government bodies. So for example, local councils in municipalities, in the regions, and even in the judicial system and in different bodies. So let me ask Randy, how is that political representation is historically and currently been in the US? What are the kind of affirmative actions and how is this being developed over there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are other places where there are reserved seats in parliament. I think India does this, for instance, with scheduled castes and tribes
Yes.
there. So that maybe has a little bit more opportunities in parliamentary systems in the US, which is a presidential system, and it's difficult to do such a thing because the representatives in the US Congress are based on jurisdictions that are geographically based and not population based, and so there's no way to reserve a seat there, for instance. So there aren't tons of opportunities for these types of affirming actions, and the US doesn't do that. So in terms of political representation, it's people who get elected to state, federal offices have to do so by the majority of the geographic electorate that they're looking to. Having said that, there are some really wide known examples of that occurring in relatively recent times. Deb Haaland became a representative from New Mexico, one of the first Native American women in Congress. There's another woman from Kansas, I believe, and now the very first Alaska Native from Alaska is representing that state as well as peoples there in Congress. There's also a Native Hawaiian in Congress as well from Hawaii. But again, these people are sort of nominated and take office based on their appeal to a wider electorate. So in terms of political power, I think ultimately in the US, political power comes from tribal governments and communities that organize as sort of outside of government. I think that push has been alongside that of other groups in the US, pushing for rights and equity and social justice type programs, policies as well.
Or you would say there's not, even at the local level or state level, any kind of affirmative actions? Because all the case you mentioned is basically going through the normal politics, or to say so, you would not say there is any kind of affirmative action?
I don't think there's, I think many people would say, and I'm not an expert on this, but at the local level, it's actually often the local community relative to that of the indigenous populations are actually worse. There's often much more antagonism and sort of because the the competition for resources is much more fierce, right? Is it water rights? Is it grazing rights? Is it hunting rights? Is it land rights? It's, you know, sort of, it's like that with those communities. And so the idea that you give extra to this population and not this population, it doesn't fly very well in the US. And so I think ultimately, and, you know, again, this is kind of anecdotal, but that's been my, you know, sort of experience, is that no, at the local state levels, the relationship is actually less less conducive, especially in the modern era, than the federal agencies.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, because we sometimes think that the situation is much better in other countries, and definitely it's not necessarily the case. How it is in Canada?
Actually, very similar to the US. I mean, obviously, we have a different political system, but there is no affirmative action for Indigenous peoples in Canada. A lot of the political representation, of course, members can be elected by to a broader electorate. The Canadian system also has a lot of people who are appointed to certain offices, and sometimes those appointments may be Indigenous people, but there's no mandated seat reserved. There's been an idea around for a very long time that has never seemed to gain traction around the idea of a First Nations province, right? And that would gain representation politically than in Canada. But what that would look like, I think, has always been a big question, an area for speculation. Again, it's been proposed numerous times whenever there's been big political questions or rethinking in Canada. But like I said, it's always kind of seemed to fall a bit on deaf ears. I'm not sure if that's a good analogy, but so I think that's it's not something that's been pursued in Canada at all.
And when there, for example, the commission for restitution, and that when what is the name of the commission that studied the reconciliation?
Oh yeah, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes.
Exactly. So in the debates in that commission, there was nothing really concrete about political representation.
So I don't believe there's ever. So I would have to read the 94 calls to action again. So I focused on a few of them. Most of them, I'm an economist, so I largely just focused on the economic calls to action rather than political representation in a mandated way. And I don't believe so. But again, I would have to read. I would encourage also the audience to read the 94 calls to action, which I now feel like I should read again.
Thank you. So, Kelly, again, you follow the discussion here in Chile about the reserved seats. Of course, we had as example, as Randy said, India, but also New Zealand was a typical case that was put in the discussion. So now that we're not back to zero, but back to the discussion from the more or less the beginning, how do you see that we should follow with this discussion?
Yeah, so for context, the social protests that a lot of people are probably very familiar with that started in October of 2019 led to an agreement between political parties that then Chileans voted a little less than 80% yes, let's continue with the process of rewriting the constitution. I think it's important to note that Chileans voted yes to that agreement and that process before Indigenous representation was defined, in contrast to gender parity that was already part of that agreement. And then there was a year of congressional conversations about what Indigenous representation would look like that were fascinating. And the end result were 17 of the 155 seats in the Constitutional Convention would be Indigenous representatives distributed between different Indigenous communities. And so that was a remarkable change. There are, at the national level, no other reserved seats for Indigenous communities. I know in CONADI, which is part of the office that was developed out of the 1993 Indigenous law, there are Indigenous representatives on a council there that are elected, that are part of decision making, although it is complicated if that is national government communicating towards Indigenous communities, or a place where you are kind of bringing together Indigenous representatives in the state into one body, but there are representatives there. Moving forward, I think it's important to point out that conversations about plurinationalism, and of course reserved seats are different, but became very much part of the same conversation. And so there started to be a lot of resistance and a lot of rhetoric, particularly on the political right and the people leading the campaign to reject the Constitution, on a lot of claims that reserved seats were not democratic, that it kind of violated a principle of one person, one vote. I think there are a lot of reasons to question that logic, but it very much became part of the rhetoric of why people should reject. I'm just looking up a survey. I think despite how public some of that critique was of kind of Indigenous representation, but I think a lot of Chileans more broadly thought, or people that voted to reject the Constitution thought of reserved seats as kind of special allocations of rights that encountered a lot of opposition. There is a survey, I'm pretty sure this is from 2008 though, that found pretty widespread support for broadly having reserved seats in Congress for Indigenous communities. So 83% of people surveyed were in support. And of course, there's a difference between left and right, but even among people that identified as right-wing, 71% supported some representation. Now, that is pre-constitutional conversations. I think kind of the rhetoric around Indigenous rights has shifted, but does show that there is kind of some support for thinking about representation. So TBD how those conversations evolve. I think it's tough, and we'll see.
Yeah, I think one of the fact that make different, for example, the case of New Zealand and the case in Chile, New Zealand is, maybe I'm wrong on that, but I think it's mainly Maori, no? So it's the Maori, and you see, okay, the Maori has a percentage of population, you give reserved seats to them. But in Chile, we have the Mapuche is the largest group, around 80% of the indigenous population, but we also have 10 or 11 other groups, some of them pretty small. No? So, for example, there were the Yagan, that the person that was elected, she received like 300 votes, this kind of thing. So that was kind of the things that were attacked in terms of how it can be that someone that get 300 votes will be the same as someone that get, I don't know, 30,000. No? So I guess this is the kind of things that really, we need the political scientists actually to kind of figure out the system that is give the representation, but also avoid this kind of potential problems.
I think another challenge is the Mapuche community. So again, about 80% of the people who identify as Indigenous in Chile, a large portion of that community is not in southern Chile, where a lot of people kind of assume these people are living. So there's a very significant portion of the Mapuche community who now live in Santiago. And so I think there is an assumption about who an Indigenous person is and who should have a reserved seat and what that political representation should look like. And so I think there's a challenge of urban Indigenous communities. How do Chileans more broadly think about representation of urban Indigenous communities?
Very interesting. Okay, so look, just the last question from my side, then I open to the audience here and also in Zoom. One of the things that actually was new to me was about the possibility of giving the indigenous group to have their own judicial system. And that was something that was very resisted by a lot of people. But in debates with lawyers, with many lawyers, they say, this is really a clear manifestation of the self-determination, like to recognize and to put together this judicial system. For me, that was relatively new, so I started kind of researching and realized, folks, that, for example, in the US, there is a system that has been there for many decades, and actually with more than 400 legal systems that are actually tribal law. So maybe, Randy, if you can relatively quickly explain us how this is work and what is your view on this system.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's another system and part of self-governance and self-determination, as you said. Many tribal governments have elected to create their own judicial system. Many have their own constitutions, some don't, but some have constitutions that they've created in the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. And over time, we've seen them amend their constitutions because originally many of them did not have a judicial branch. So they've added that. Sort of the population has determined over time that they want to be self-governing and also have their own court system. And so, that's been implemented over time. Not all of them have it, and not all of them have the same types of judicial branches. Some, they do, certain types of cases and not others. The benefit has been, again, the ability to govern, wrongdoers and people who break the law, on tribal jurisdictions, and to sanction people in whatever ways. So there's, standard ways of addressing law breaking, but then there are sort of alternative means, sort of remunerative methods that make amends outside of sort of the criminal system, and so those also have had some increasing, sort of acceptance, and especially with regard to some social behavioral activities. There's at least some evidence that it's improving conditions and helping to rehabilitate communities, individuals in the community, as opposed to just, locking people away, perhaps, right? And that tribal communities, nations are better positioned to know which individuals will be, accepting of that and would sort of benefit from that, as opposed to what had been historically the case oftentimes is a federal court system that had very little leniency or very little sort of on the ground knowledge. So again, this idea of sort of bringing the governance down and decision making for court systems, in particular with regard to many social, like non like sort of wealth and asset based type of judicial decisions in court and cases.
Exactly. I think one of the most important debates here was like what kind of crimes will be going through the normal or traditional system and which one will go to the indigenous system, no? And as that, I think that since that was not clear in the proposal, this created some conflict. In the US, I understand there is something called the Major Crimes Act. So basically this defines which crimes can be prosecuted through federal law and must be prosecuted to federal law, and which one to tribal courts. So that's more or less the way it works.
Yeah, for the most part. And then there's also, remember, there's the other possibility is non-natives coming onto native land, and are they able to be prosecuted by the tribal government? And there's a very famous court case called Oliphant, which said, oh, well, that can't really happen. And so that's potentially problematic as well, because then you could have, and this is sort of where, again, tribal nations have been seeking to remedy that situation so that they do also have jurisdiction over anyone committing crimes in their communities. But that hasn't been solved so far. So yes, you have these multiple jurisdictionals, and the degree to which the crime or the case being brought, the impact of it, whether it be, again, homicides, violence, or, robbery or, other criminal acts.
Thank you. How is the situation in Canada?
Generally speaking, First Nations band governments on reserve, generally speaking, don't have judicial systems that are legible to the Canadian state. So they might have institutions of internal institutions for resolution related to crimes that aren't, again, observed to outsiders. So again, the US might be a closer example to what was proposed in the Constitution, but of course, like Brandy mentioned, there's all sorts of very important details to how all these things are allowed to function. But there are moves in Canada to increase First Nations jurisdiction over criminal and civil cases.
Yeah. Thank you. Kelly, you followed the debate. I mean, that was for me a surprise proposal. That was so. What's your opinion?
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, this being a word, plurinationalism being a word that has some experience being developed in the Latin American context.
Yeah.
I think Bolivia is a good example to look through that did establish degrees of judicial pluralism. And I think, kind of echoing what Randy said, I think what's interesting about how judicial pluralism was implemented in Bolivia is there's a tremendous stat that I don't have off the top of my head, but about the number of indigenous peoples that do not have access to traditional justice, the traditional judicial system. And so I think there's something incredibly important about who has access to what types of justice, and judicial pluralism as being a way to kind of, again, get governance closer to communities and having more decision-making authority over judicial decisions. I think the challenge in the Chilean context was the ambiguity that you mentioned. So this became kind of a hot button issue in the news about who would be prosecuted for what, and did this mean, something could be only processed through there, and so there were a lot of misinterpretations about what would fall under the Constitution, and was this completely independent from the Constitution, and no, this is certain crimes, very specific jurisdictions that communities would have jurisdiction over under this broader umbrella of the Constitution, but there was significant misinformation about that complicated the conversation.
It was a difficult, complicated issue. Okay, I think we can discuss a lot of other issues, but in honor of time, I want to kind of open the floor first to the audience here. I don't know if there are questions here. Felipe, we have Felipe Jordan from Catholic University in Chile.
Thank you. So I wanted to ask of your opinion, in the context of the US, Canada, and also your opinion to the Kelly, about the importance of the territorial base, and thinking about kind of the wide array of experiences both in the US, Canada, and in Chile, kind of where you have one extreme where you have some people that through history they gain kind of a large consolidated case. I think maybe one of the largest is maybe the Navajo Nation. I think it's kind of one of example that pops up to my mind as this, that could be a country itself, like so how large it is, how many people are there. And in contrast, there's some other indigenous people that have very fragmented territories, or that sometimes don't have territories at all. They have been kind of pushed to the cities, but they have been able to maintain their identity and feeling as a people itself. On the other hand, kind of the different kind of solutions, or basically thinking of, should they focus on consolidated territories, or is there or political representation in terms of community action to push the state, and seeing how strategies have changed in that kind of array of different situation in this different context.
Randy?
I'll go second.
Yeah, okay, well, done.
All right, so maybe I'll repeat your question just to make sure I understand fully. So are you asking, should nations be focusing on increasing or asserting jurisdiction over territory in a way that is continuous, like a continuous piece of land? Or should they be focusing on gaining political representation within, say, the general political system in Canada or the US or Chile?
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't have used the word should. It's like, what do you service the context of Canada? And do you see that the people that are in a different situation in terms of the fractalization of the territory kind of pursue different strategies?
I see. Okay. So that's a really interesting question. So I think nations in Canada have pursued different strategies depending on whether they have a historic treaty or not. If you do not have a historic treaty, so generally, even if you're in a non-treaty area, you still might have a reserve, but in terms of your ability to increase the size of your territory through a comprehensive land claim, the potential gains from that process maybe are very large, right? So in addition, many reservations are a little bit, are not as parceled out or fractionated as in the case of Chile or in the United States. They tend to be relatively small, but not everywhere. So one of the biggest, most important, essentially Indigenous self-governance right was Nunavut, right? So it became a territory and is a very large landmass, relatively like low population density, but it became a territory, right? Like the Yukon or the Northwest Territories. And that, although there's been no economic studies what that's meant for Nunavut, I think it's generally seen to be a very successful enterprise that also meant like internal political representation too, or representation more broadly within Canada. We also know for some really great work by Fernando Aragon on modern treaties and comprehensive land claims that actually implementing a comprehensive land claim agreement actually can substantially improve real incomes, not just for Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people in the region. And part of his argument is that you create a clear definition of who's governing and property rights in an area. So if the strategy that is pursued is really over land, I think in making sure that responsibility and jurisdiction is clear. Like where do firms have to go to negotiate? What court system do they have to go through? I think that's important. And generally, but in treated areas, again, some have pursued treaty land entitlement to gain areas that are actually discontinuous from the reservation, but in economically really vibrant areas like cities, right? And that's been, again, very little evidence we have so far on it has seemed to be useful. But there are other strategies too, where people have just tried to increase the jurisdiction they can assert over their reservations where they are, like through the First Nations Fiscal Management Act or the First Nations Land Management Act, which are First Nations driven institutions where you opt out of the Indian Act processes. But generally speaking, I don't see, most of the focus in Canada has been over reacquisition of land, greater assertion of jurisdiction. So it's kind of building where things already are, maybe outside of the other political processes in Canada. I think that's, so they haven't really pursued strategies over land, but in different ways, the ability to cover land.
Thank you. Randy, now you're second.
I'm obligated now. Yeah, I mean, so I think, in terms of what Indigenous people are pushing for, again, it differs depending on the population and the group. Some are seeking to be recognized by state and federal governments. Others are, it's kind of like what Don was saying, others are seeking to affirm existing rights and rules that they have in place in terms of sort of exercise of various rights, such as hunting, fishing, use of resources, practicing of traditional activities like that. Other Indigenous peoples, again, are looking to get their land back. And then I should say, just to be clear, Native Hawaiians are an Indigenous people in the U.S. and there's a significant proportion looking to become an independent nation state, as the Kingdom of Hawaii was up until 1893. So there's another component that's not being discussed here that exists for in other places, this idea of independence. There's sort of existing within an existing nation state, but there is a route potentially, and that's independence. And this is not without precedent. Of course, there are many former colonies that were decolonized, post World War II in places in Africa, Southeast Asia, but also in the Pacific, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, the Northern Marianas. There are places in which this has occurred as well. They were part of the US and they voted in a plebiscite and elected to become independent. And, there's some movement for that in Puerto Rico as well. I don't know that it's exactly that far, but there are these options that exist in these, non-state territories, although Hawaii is a state, but there is a push for that as well amongst Native Hawaiians.
Thank you. Kelly?
Yeah, so, I think first, before the Chilean context, I think the Bolivian mobilization has been really interesting here because you see a much bigger percentage of the country identifying as Indigenous, so somewhere between 40 and 60%, depending on kind of what time period and what data that you're looking at, but also tremendous variation between kind of highland and lowland communities and very different mobilization strategies and very different requests. So I think first I would just echo what others have said, is that kind of what the community is asking for and what strategies are going to be pursued will depend on that community, but also on, you know, what state policies towards that community have done to that community. So, you know, what Highland Indigenous communities in Bolivia are asking for are very much structured by kind of internal processes of colonization that displaced a lot of people to different places, and then of course they're going to structure what that community is asking for. So I think kind of the percentage and the geographic location of the community will matter a lot in terms of who's asking for what. And then of course those state policies. So like there are some really interesting cases of land purchases for communities down in close to Tierra del Fuego, where completely different context and completely different request, but because of the way that the state policy has been developed, they have been able to have land purchased and very, very complicated related to what is that community's demands and what are they interested in compared to what is the state able and willing to provide. I think the other question that's really interesting in the Chilean context that we need to be very, very open to admitting variation within the Mapuche community and what Mapuche demands are. I don't think we can say there is one demand, and there's, you know, a big conversation right now of to what extent should the Mapuche community work through institutional state-led processes. So there's been some, I'm glad there's been some visibility to some work after the September 4th vote about critiques of plurinationalism as too institutional and too state-led. And so I think, you know, regardless of what anyone thinks kind of should be the case, I think there are a significant, you know, group that are going to act on that perspective of what the pursuit of Indigenous rights might look like, and then strategies that they can do. So like, of course, Fernando Pairican's work has been really awesome here, showing kind of the split in mobilization towards a very institutional and gradual route to pursue Indigenous rights through the state. And of course, that's going to require compromise and negotiation and conversation. And then other groups that are pursuing kind of more radical extra-institutional demands. So yeah, I think the should question is hard. I think more is kind of understanding this broad variation and how state strategies and state policies kind of structure what Indigenous communities are going to demand at what moments in time.
Thank you. If there are more questions from the audience, I will move to allow the people in Zoom to ask questions. You can raise your hand digitally. I will change the view here just to see if there are any questions from the audience in Zoom. Give you a couple of minutes just to see if there is any question over there. No, okay, that's good. Yeah, we already have been discussing
If we need a question, I have one.
Huh?
If we need a question, I have one. But if there are others, then
No, you can go ahead with your question, definitely.
were there others?
No, no one asked.
Okay. So one thing that I found really interesting about the conversation happening in Chile is a big conversation about what cases are the appropriate comparison cases. And there was kind of debate about, you know, is recognizing Chile as plurinational, is that more comparable to the Bolivian case, and kind of implying some instability in Bolivia around the election, the Abel's last election. And other people saying, no, the US, Canada are the more comparable cases. So there was kind of this debate happening of where should we be looking in terms of comparable examples of plurinationalism. And I'm just curious how that debate about what countries are the examples kind of lands for you two as much more comfortable with the experiences of those countries. Because I think the debate kind of flattened the experience of the countries, and I think too often associated plurinationalism with a kind of presumed development status. So yeah, when you hear that kind of Canada, the US were examples of what plurinationalism might look like, kind of what raises concerns or hesitancies or other emotions.
Randy went second last time. Maybe I'll let you go first.
I mean, but maybe just to, for example, to complement, one of the things that was mentioned in that debate is like, okay, in Bolivia and Ecuador, there is a clear definition of plurinationality, but you have mentioned many times that you call it First Nations, no?
Yeah.
And you call it nations, this group. And that was actually kind of an intellectual debate that should we really call nations or people, for example, no? And that was kind of a part of the debate. Because in Chile we have the tradition of have a very centralized state nation, no? So nation state, state and nation were one by one, no? And basically this idea of plurinationality was the idea to say, no, these are other nations, pre-existent nations, and this is one way to understand plurinationality with all these aspects that we say, access to land and to judicial systems and to political representations, kind of this, no? So yeah, I don't know if that helps the discussion or
I mean, I think I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the use of the term nations. I think that's why it's used. It's to signify and address the fact that there were pre-existing governance systems and peoples on various lands prior to European and prior to the nation states as they are today. So absolutely, and that's sort of the push, by many of the tribal nations to assert the use of that term, use of those names, to change their names, even to call themselves, put the word nation in their official title. So that I think is something that also has emerged over time in the US as well. This sort of addressing in order to, again, reassert this sense of these places, these systems were here for, millennia, perhaps, right? And self-governing. And so, yeah, I mean, but back to the other question too, this idea of, what's the good model? And this is something I and maybe others have grappled with as well. I don't think there's a good model. I think we all have all these different countries. You can, again, go to New Zealand, Australia, Mexico, and Canada and the US as well, that have indigenous peoples, and think about the ways in which, so I guess my simplest answer would be, I would pick and choose the best aspects of all of these pre-existing examples and hope to find ways to merge them or convert them for whatever situation you're looking at. So, because I think there are things that worked in different places or are working in different places. They don't always transfer or translate because of governance systems and nation state systems and or cultural norms, social norms that don't make it possible. So I think, I think one of the reasons Don, myself, others have started to do work like this and to do work collaboratively and to encourage others as well to do work in this, because I think we have a lot to learn from each other. Yes. Because I think there's a number of amazing, interesting examples, and we don't share them nearly as much as we could, because we don't inhabit the same spaces in academia, in the world, and research and publishing. And so that's one of the reasons, we have been, from Canada to the US, but hoping to encourage more of the world and engage with more of the world, because we have stuff in the US and Canada to learn from other places as well. So it's not just a one-way direction by any means.
Yeah, that's an important reflection. And I think it's been also part of what we try to do here in this workshop, now that's bringing together scholars from different disciplines, 2 disciplines here, but also from different countries, learning different perspectives with different methods, with different examples. So, Don?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that Brandon makes a great point, is that there's so much we can learn from each other, from different examples. And again, to hold up Canada and the US as some sort of ideal of what Indigenous rights should look like seems terribly wrong, I think, for someone who's part of the country and observing what goes on. I think one of the things that also the solutions are going to vary so much by like context, and what's going to work in one context may not work in another. So, for example, the Navajo Nation was mentioned. The Navajo Nation is literally 100 times in terms of population larger than one of the communities near me, right? So just functionally, like what does self-governance look like when we have these different population sizes? Because in terms of just general the potential for state capacity, it's going to be different. So how do we organize institutions that respect people's independent cultures, internal legal systems? Like in Canada, one thing that's very interesting that I should have mentioned actually when we were talking a little bit about judicial systems is that Indigenous law in Canada is separate from like Aboriginal law. Aboriginal law is like the law of like the Canadian state with respect to Indigenous people. But Indigenous nations have their own laws and own legal systems, and those actually are recognized as in Canadian law. But how do we understand them? How do we again make them legible to Canadian legal systems is an open question. Oral history can be taken as evidence of written documents from the past in Canadian court systems. So developing systems in ways in which the Canadian legal system can better interact with Indigenous legal systems and states, I think is an important thing to think through as well.
Great. I think that's a nice reflection to maybe end our panel, that hopefully we'll have more instances to debate both in academic terms, but also in terms of this more policy oriented debate. So I don't know if you want to have any closing remarks? Otherwise, I think we can conclude here. Again, thanking, Randy, first of all, for joining in the distance, and of course, to guests that we have here, Don and Kelly, people that have participated in the workshop. And with this, we close both this panel and this workshop. So thank you very much, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thank you.